Welcome to Unlocking Science. Our goal is to glorify God by studying and unlocking the secrets of His amazing creation. I'm your host, Mr. P, and as you can see, we're in a little bit different location today. Rather than in the lab or inside the museum, we're out in the beautiful botanical gardens at the Creation Museum. And I'm joined today by Mr. Dale Spada, and he's here to talk to us about planting zones and some other things here at the gardens. So what are your main roles and responsibilities here at the museum?
Well, my title's curator, which means basically I catalog everything, every plant here. So in addition to that, we just help in general care for the museum, all the different, everything outside, the grass and everything.
So we have a lot of green space here at the Creation Museum, botanical gardens where people can walk around and enjoy. We've got a lake down the hill behind us, beautiful green grass. All of those things are cared for by the team that you work with.
Yes.
And it's all overseen by Tim Schmidt. He's our main designer of all of these things. So lots of beautiful things for you to see if you come here to the Creation Museum. We're going to be talking about the topic of planting zones today. And what I've got here in my hand is a map that's produced by the United States Department of Agriculture. And this is a map of the different plant hardiness zones, or planting zones people usually call it. And you can see it's got a bunch of different colors here, and there's a scale over here on this side that help us understand what all these things mean. And this map is basically a map of the minimum extreme temperatures over 30 years. And looking at those things, that's going to help us determine what plants would grow best in different zones. So when we think about a long-term picture of temperature, things like this, that's related to the concept of climate, not the concept of weather. So if we think about weather's a short-term phenomenon. So today I would describe the weather as sunny with a slight bit of overcast skies, and we have a temperature somewhere probably around 80 degrees right now. It's pretty warm and it's humid. All of those things would describe the weather right now. That weather will change in an hour and 2 hours. So weather changes, but climate is much more stable. It's a long-term picture of those weather patterns that we see. And this map helps us understand those climate factors and how they affect planting. So why don't you explain to us a little bit more, Dale, about where we are in this planting zone map here in northern Kentucky and what that means for the types of plants that we can grow.
Well, we're in northern Kentucky, which puts us at 6A. So they've gotten a lot better over the years. Yeah, right there.
There's our bump right there.
The first plant zone map started in the early 1900s, and then it's just gone from there with more data entry and more locations to actually give us data. There's 4,500 different locations. This was originated, or I believe this was made in 2012, so it's getting better and better and better over the years. But you actually can go online. It has an interactive map. You put in your zip code or your address, whichever, and then it'll just take you right to where you are and it'll tell you what zone you're in. But this is just a guide. There are still many other factors that go in besides this guide. This is a good guide. I mean, you got to start somewhere, and this is a good place to start. But there's microclimates and there's other variables that really help us to decide where a plant will survive or not.
So you mentioned the word microclimate, and that's just what it sounds like. Different areas can have small variations in temperature extremes and those types of things. So for example, here in northern Kentucky, we have lots of hills and valleys in this rolling hill structure. So if your house is down in the bottom of a valley compared to the top of a hill, you would have a slightly different climate, that microclimate structure we think about. And you might want to grow plants in different ways. For example, even on the sunny side or the dark side of your home, in different seasons are going to affect those things. So when we think about this map and the way things are organized, it gives us this temperature reference to think about what things would grow well in this area. But as you said, it's just a starting point.
It's a guide.
So we're going to look around the area right here that we have, and we're going to try and find some of the native plants that we have here in Kentucky. So we're going to get the camera to turn around over this way across the trail. And we can see right here, off in the distance, up these leaves right here, we have right above us, towering over us, this big locust tree. Now this is a black locust tree, and if we could get up on some of the leaves and the branches there, we'd see that it actually has some little tiny thorns. But there's another type of locust tree. We also have a honey locust. How's the honey locust different from this one?
The thorns, the size of the thorns. The honey locust produces 2 to 3 inch black thorns, and you'll definitely know when you find it because it'll reach down and get you. But so this also has thorns and can be difficult to prune. But the honey locust is, like I said, the thorns are much more aggressive.
Mm-hmm. So there's an example of a plant that we would say developed those things after the curse, because Genesis describes those thorns and thistles as a result of the curse. So originally those trees wouldn't have had those, but they've developed them since the fall. All right, let's go ahead and, go ahead and add a bit.
Well, basically a thorn, horticulturally, a thorn is a branch that hasn't developed completely. A spine, which is like on a cacti, is a leaf that hasn't developed completely. And then what you have on a rose is called a prickle. So basically it's a protrusion from the bark. So in Genesis 3:17 is where Adam sinned. In Genesis 3:18, God said the curse, or the ground will be cursed that you stand on, and thorns and thistles you will have to deal with. So Genesis 3:18, if you go there in your Bible and read that, that's where the introduction of thorns actually happened. Horticulturally, I was just explaining to you how that could be in the garden when it was good, but not fully developed, later developed.
All right, let's go ahead and send the camera on around this way. We're going to look at this next tree right over here. This is a native species to Kentucky, and that is a cherry tree. You might notice this one has been cut off down in this area. If we can see the green laser I'm pointing up there. And then these branches have grown up out of that cut off stem. So cherry trees are a very common tree in this area. If we pan over to the left a little bit more, what's this tree we've got right up here, Dale?
That is a gold dust dawn redwood. And it's a gold dust you can see as the sun hits it. The right side is a little more gold color than the left, so it really likes the sunlight, and it creates that golder hue to it. So there's a dawn redwood in general is a green tree, and we have plenty of those around this area as well.
Okay, if we swing around to the left a little bit more here, this tree over here is a walnut tree, and this is a black walnut. So we'll be walking through the woods and step on these big round fruits in the fall that have this green husk around them. Lots of walnut trees growing around this area. What's something kind of special about the walnuts?
Well, historically, besides timber, obviously, historically, the walnut itself, if you've ever picked one up in the woods, you'll get a brown dye on your hand. So they used them as dye as well in the Bible, and still, I guess, in other places of the world they still do.
Yes. So if you've ever hulled the walnuts to get to the nuts inside and the meat inside there, you'll actually get very dark brown.
Yes,
stain your skin very well.
And it's hard to come off.
Okay, as we swing back around here, there's a big tall tree right next to us. It's another locust tree, but there's something kind of growing as a vine up alongside here. What's this vine growing up here?
That is something that a lot of people have a hard time figuring out. So that is a hydrangea, a climbing hydrangea. So, and then the next question that I get asked is, will it hurt the tree? Not yet. So the root system actually doesn't go deep enough into the bark to damage the tree. But that's you can see it's already flowered. You can see some of the flowers.
You can see a little cluster right in here where the flowers have already died back, and that's where the little berries will form. Now most people would know a hydrangea is a common shrub they grow in their yard, and it has a shrubby character. But oftentimes we can get these vining characters from the same type of plant.
Yes, yes. There's 6 different family orientations for the hydrangea. So.
Growing up out west, we had poison ivy, but I was used to it being a little bush on the ground. And when we moved out east here, it climbs up trees, and I didn't realize that. And I was hanging a deer stand one time, and there was this beautiful vine giving me good cover. I wound up with poison ivy all over it, but I can tell you, I can spot that from a mile away now. All right, one more of the native trees we've got. If we pan up here, this huge tree you can see in the background, this big canopy, this is an ash tree. And the ash trees in this area get very large, but they're actually kind of in danger a little bit. What's the danger with these ash trees right now, Dale?
Well, emerald ash borer is an insect that is moving through the area. It already has moved through this area, but there's a concern that it's going to move back. So it actually goes up the canopy or up the cambium of the tree and kills it. It cuts off the sugar supply.
Yeah, it eats around the bark, and then there's no supply of those nutrients to the rest of the tree, and the tree's going to die. The leaves can't send any nutrition down in the fall, and so that dies, and the bark will come loose. And so as you're driving along the highways here in Kentucky and Ohio in those areas, you actually see massive stands of these ash trees that are just dead skeletons hanging up in the skyline in lots of those areas.
We have treated ours twice, but there's a limit. I mean, it's expensive to care for them or to treat them, but this is just such a big part of our of the gardens. It creates shade for basically for the whole rainforest. So really want to try to save that tree.
Yep. And back behind, underneath of that, this one might be a little tricky to get on the camera here, but we've got a smaller tree that's growing in here, and this is one that you've planted recently. Why did you plant this elm tree here?
Well, for the future. We try to think about the future when we're planting and making planting decisions, along with all the other decisions we make. The next generation is what we're trying to consider. So this is our next canopy. This is an elm tree. Next question is, why would we choose an elm, considering all of the American elms are gone because of disease? Well, this is a resistant cultivar. So the way they find a resistant cultivar is after the disease came through, this one was still standing. And they used this to they cultivated it, and they came up with this one. It's called a colonial spirit. There are a few other resistant, not impervious, resistant varieties of elm as well.
So as those diseases move through and wipe out the plants, this one survived, and so for whatever reason it's going to be able to, we don't know the exact mechanisms that are at play there, but it's going to be able to survive that. So that's
disease.
That disease. Another one comes along, then we've got the other issue. Chestnut trees have been susceptible to blight in the east here and different things, and so now they're sparser than they used to be in the past. So all of those things are resilient structures that God has built into these plants to help them survive those things. Now, thinking about the planting zone that we're in, we said we're in zone 6A and thinking about those things. If we wanted to plant some plants here in the gardens, are there kind of some guidelines for the dates we'd want to work around there?
Yes, you're referring to annuals.
Yes, for annuals.
So there's annuals, perennials, and then evergreens, so generally. So annuals, our break point, our cutoff has always been Mother's Day, or thereabouts, May 15th or so, has been historically, over the last few decades, we haven't had we may have had a frost, but we haven't had a freeze after that date until this year. We had 2 freezes. They're historic because people spent all the money putting all these annuals out, and they used that date as a guideline, and then still they lost material. So you do have to use this as a guide, not as a hard fast rule, because there are variables. And there's some variables that we just cannot control, obviously.
Yep. And our family planted some beans in some pots on the back deck, and those things got hit by that freeze. And beans are usually pretty hardy for a light frost, but they died right away. And our hostas, which are a perennial type of plant that grow in lots of garden spaces around here, you might be familiar with their big leaves and the clusters of flowers that come up. Our leaves actually got frostbit, and you can see patches of dead on them where the frost had killed them. We have a small Japanese maple, which is a horticultural variety of maple tree, and it has very thin, fine leaves, and the leaves were so thin that they froze, and a lot of the leaves died on that tree. But enough of it survived, it's probably going to make it back. So you mentioned those terms, annual and perennial. What's kind of the distinction between those types of plants?
Well, an annual, it just survives through the summer. It just seeds once and it's done. It's an annual. So a perennial, for us, well, it changes depending on your zone or depending on where you are in the country. It flourishes through the summer, and then it goes dormant. It looks dead to some people, but it's actually dormant, in a dormant stage. And depending on the plant, sometimes I leave the top of that just for winter interest. And then the spring comes around and we may cut that off. Say, for instance, some of the grasses that we have, we leave them through the winter just for the winter interest. And then in the spring we'll cut them off before, and each one can start at different times depending on the plant. You know, some may start all the way back in May, some may start in February. So it just depends.
Yeah, and then with a perennial, like the hostas I mentioned, they have a bulb structure underneath above their roots that actually goes dormant. All the nutrients will pour back into that, they'll store that, and then it generates back from that in the springtime.
Right, so during the winter time, to think that nothing's happening is even though it's in its dormancy, it's still bringing in nutrients and storing up energy for the spring so it can jump out.
And then there are some other interesting ones like biennials, carrots, for example.
Biennials that are typically, again, it's God's creation and there's variables, but typically it'll come back twice.
Yeah, they go through a 2-year cycle.
Yeah, there's flowers that are considered, Gerber daisies are biennial or can be biennial. You plant them in the ground and you don't remove them, and the next year a lot of times they'll come back. I've gotten 3 years out of the annuals before.
All right, so when we think about the other plants that we've got around the gardens here, now a lot of these are not native to this area, but you've chosen varieties of these that are appropriate for our zone to some degree.
Yes. So part of landscaping, and Tim Schmidt's the VP of horticulture, he designed these gardens. So when you go to these different areas, they have a feel. You're in a different environment all the way around you. So a lot of it's the feel. So even though some of these, like this banana tree, don't look like they would survive here, this one does. I can go into that in just a second, but basically we chose plants that feel more like that environment. This is the rainforest, so a lot of the plants in here have that feel, including hosta, and some of those are perfectly fine in this area. They don't need a lot of additional care for over the winter. They just come right back.
Yeah, now if we can have the cameraman turn around behind us, over here we've got a plant that lots of people might grow in their garden beds, flower beds. This is called an elephant ear. And this variety that we've got here is different from another one we have growing out front. What's this variety?
This one's called pink china, and if you look at the stem, it gives it away. It's pink. So this one is much more vigorous. You can see how it's just taken off, and it is okay in zone 6A, and it comes back much quicker. There's another one in the front, it's called Big Dipper. It is more of a 7 zone area, and it takes a little bit warmer climate for it to come back. So the growth on those is a little bit shorter right now, and as it warms up through the summer, they'll just continue to grow.
And around us you can see you saw some bamboo over there. This is another type of bamboo we've got growing in this area. Bamboo, is that a native species of this area?
You know, I actually think there are some varieties, but it's a huge family of plants. Got some people walking by. Hello. And this one is Sassa palmatum. This one's actually a japonica, which is a giveaway for where it's from. It originates in Japan. It's right, japonica. So, and actually, this one's really cool because it's also used in cooking. You can take this leaf and you can the leaf gets much larger, but you can wrap your food up in it. And I had a family from Japan that was explaining that to me, and it was really, really fun. We get people from all over the world here at the Creation Museum, and we have a lot of fun walking around and talking to them about plants. And you know, sometimes, like I was saying before, there's different plants that are weeds here or weeds there and not weeds here, and vice versa. So it's very interesting to talk about all the different climates and all the different plant analogies folks have when they walk around.
So you use that term weed. Now there's no real scientific definition of a weed. A weed is just something that's basically growing where we don't want it to.
That's right.
So there's an example out here further in the gardens. We don't have any of them right here, called a Mexican petunia. Now we plant it here in the gardens because it produces beautiful dark colored stalks and these beautiful purple flowers. But other people, say down south near Florida and those southern climates, why would they consider it a weed?
Well, the definition of a weed is anything, like you said, anything you don't want, basically. It doesn't mean that you don't have to care for it. So there's stewardship and there's dominion. Caring for something is just being a good steward. So back to what I was saying, when I walked folks around, they say, well, that grows in ditches in Florida. The Mexican petunia in that climate is invasive. For us, we use it as an annual because it adds beauty to the garden and things. So that's being a good steward and practicing dominion. We're not planting something that's going to get out of control for us. You mentioned dandelions one other time we were talking in the lawn. Those are actually used in herbal medicine and things like that, but we don't want them in our lawn. So everything is good in its proper spot.
And when dandelions grow out in meadow in the forest or in those other types of areas, they have natural competitors and control. When they get into our lawn, they tend to take over, and we're cultivating our lawns for a purpose. Just like if we're growing a garden, I don't want the wrong type of plants growing in there because they'll draw nutrients away from the things I'm growing for food. So weeds are just in the wrong area. All right, last topic we're going to cover, you alluded to a minute ago, is this kind of a tree. It's not really a tree right next to us, and this is a banana plant. Now, we are in Kentucky. What in the world is a banana plant growing in Kentucky?
And that is exactly what I said when I first walked around the Creation Museum. What is this doing here? It's not a tree. The stem is actually a pseudostem. So as the tree grows, these are actually leaves that just continue to wrap around the trunk. The pseudo trunk gets bigger and bigger. And you can see that the way that we get these to overwinter, we treat them like perennials. We have to cut them off in the winter or in the fall when they start declining. We cut them off and we put a good few feet of mulch on every single one of them. And then in the spring, when it warms up and they start emerging up through the mulch, we have to go in and remove all that, most of it by hand, because we don't want to pierce the trunk, the pseudo trunk, with a pitchfork or anything like that. So that's the that's the link that we go to here to get these to thrive.
So if somebody wanted to plant something like this that really belongs in a zone that's much, much lower, then they'd have to go to those special extreme measures to be able to compensate for those types of
normally.
things.
Now this one, if you look up Musa Bajo, that's what this is. Zonally, it actually is considered okay for this zone, but it's at the very, very tip of that. And again, the zone guide is just a guide. It's not an absolute. So if we have a hard winter, we have a harder time getting some of these to come back. If we have a late start to the summer, which right now these have in the past, this is my 9th summer, they've been 3 or 4 foot taller than they are right now. They will get there. They'll get to 18 feet tall or so through the summer through irrigation, fertilization. This is all water. So this is a water plant. So you have to water. What is a rainforest? It's a forest with a lot of rain. So we use irrigation instead of rain. So
this would be a plant that wouldn't be appropriate for a place like Phoenix, Arizona, because it would require so much water, and water is scarce in that
That's
climate.
right.
So you've got to consider factors like that. Not just, the planting zone isn't just about hot and cold and the temperature extremes, but also about the type of water that you're willing to apply to maintain the plants as well.
Environmental variabilities.
So we would call this a zone pusher. It's really pushing the edge of the zone, and we have to go to some extreme measures to be able to keep these things growing here.
Definitely. And this quantity as well. I mean, having a couple here and there tucked in behind a corner somewhere is one thing, but having, the whole area like this, it really does take quite an effort.
Or even some people will grow them in large pots and bring them into an indoor space where the temperature is a little more
That's another option.
controlled.
You could put something like this in a pot and it would survive through the winter. You would do just what I did, what I was describing there. You would just take it back and then put it in your garage, let it overwinter, and then bring it back out.
All right, I hope that gives you a little taste for the different ways God has created all of these plants. Now, the zone maps and things, you can find online resources for those through the USDA, and that's a way that you can kind of determine what things might be appropriate for your flower beds or even planting vegetables and things. And that's going to give you a good guide. But remember, we can't control the weather, only God does that. That's there are going to be some surprises in those types of things. Now, as always, we've scratched the surface on this topic. There's a lot more to learn and study.
Absolutely.
If you ever come here to the Creation Museum, we hope you get a chance to take one of these botanical tours or see Dale's talk about the plants of the Bible. We'd love to interact with you, engage with you on those things. And until we see you next time, get out and enjoy all of God's amazing creation.
Amen.